What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be addressing a comment that has been recurring on my channel, and I've made a couple of small videos to kind of address this in the past, but I want to make sure that we get another solid video out here giving you guys tips on how to align your defensive line in order to get more pressure on the quarterback in Madden 22. Like I said, specifically, we're going to be looking at Madden 22 today. This does also somewhat apply to previous year's Maddens, but we do want to keep in mind that the game plays slightly different from year to year, and there are a couple of things that can definitely be taken advantage of in Madden 22 that might not necessarily be there for you in previous Maddens. Now, in today's video, I'm going to talk about some of the simpler adjustments that you can make to try to generate pressure with your defensive line, but I'm also going to talk about some more detailed adjustments that you guys can make, including formation subs and things of that nature. So the first thing that I actually want to talk about here is a basic concept that we generally are going to try to implement against the CPU. And I shouldn't say CPU because we're going to try to do the same thing against users, but the general concept here is that with the new system in place for the past couple of seasons with pass rushing points and blocker resistance points, you generally want to try to create different matchups for your defensive line and your pass rushers throughout the game, and you can do that with basic depth chart adjustments. The more that you get these guys moving around to different positions, the less the offensive line are going to be able to build up resistance against them, and that's going to help you out tremendously. So what you can do, and I'm just going to go with a 4-3 today to make things simple because 4-3 translates pretty directly to a nickel defense in terms of your defensive line. Similar personnel are going to be on the field. So what you can do in terms of your defensive line here is in a 4-3, for example, whenever you're in your base formations, you can have your premier pass rusher maybe on the right side, which you see here with Von Miller on the right side, and then your secondary pass rusher on the opposite side, on the left side, or I should flip it, I should say, because we're looking at this from the defensive perspective. So Von Miller's the left end, and Trey Hendrickson's the right end, and then my interior defensive line is just staggered as it normally would be. My best guy is at the number 1, my second best guy is at the number 2, and what you can do in order to create different matchups and make sure that those resistance points aren't building up as quickly for the offensive line is when you go to your specialists, you can flip those guys around. And so you can have your rushing left end be somebody different and your rushing right end be the opposite person. So in this situation, if I wanted to create different matchups, I would want to switch Von Miller to be my rushing right end, and I would want Trey Hendrickson to be my rushing left end. That is going to flip their positions in comparison to where they are normally on the field in a 4-3, and it's going to get them flipping sides, which is going to create different matchups. Likewise, with your rushing defensive tackles, you can switch it so that maybe Davis is the number 1, and he's going to be on that same side, and Fletcher Cox is the number 2, and he's going to be on the right side. Now, the way that it works this year, in previous years, they had the ability to switch where your defensive tackles were actually lining up because, they would line up differently depending on the 1 and the 3 technique. This year, it's just left and right. So your left defensive tackle is going to be the 1 and your right defensive tackle is going to be the 2. So you can simply flip them back and forth in that direction. And so what's going to happen whenever you do that type of thing is you're going to end up with these guys flipping back and forth, and you're just going to be generating different matchups. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get more pressure, but it is one way to generate different matchups, prevent those blocker resistance points from getting too high, and allow you to hopefully get more pressure. Now, the next thing to talk about here is auto subs. And the reason that we want to talk about auto subs is because you're probably not getting enough pressure with your defensive line because they're running out of pass rush points. In previous years, that you could do unlimited number of pass rush moves to get to the quarterback, but they are limited in the next gen Madden, in Madden 22 and even in Madden 21. You're limited in terms of the number of pass rush moves that you can actually do. And so I think a lot of people don't realize that as you get later into a drive or as you get later into a game, players may not have all of their pass rush points. They may be out of pass rush points, and you're sitting back there in coverage and nobody's getting to the quarterback. And the reason is that they don't have any ability to get off their blocks in the first place. That can be eliminated by bringing in auto subs for your defensive end positions, your D-tackle positions, and making sure that you have guys rotating in at least occasionally to give those guys a break. You can bring guys in that'll be fresh off the bench and have maybe a pass rush point or two, and if they're solid enough players, you can rotate them in even more often, as you guys will see here on this Cincinnati Bengals team. I actually have multiple defensive linemen that I like to rotate in, and I build up my depth behind my defensive line so that I can get guys rotating into the game and get consistent pressure. You will see less consistent pressure whenever these guys start to utilize their pass rush points and then run out of them. So I have Sam Hubbard, Joseph Osai, DJ Reader, Tyler Shelvin, and Ndamukong Suh, all guys that can rotate in on my defensive line and aid in getting pressure because, again, they'll be different matchups. They won't be facing the same type of resistance that the guys in the front are facing, and they will have their own set of pass rush points and maybe some ability to generate pressure on the quarterback. So those are just two minor ways and very easy ways that you guys can get consistent pressure and consistent opportunities, I should say, to get pressure on the quarterback and try to break up the consistency of the blocking of the offensive line. However, what do we do in order to generate more pressure beyond that? What can we do in order to try to get more pressure on the quarterback? Well, I want to first start off by showing you a concept here with the defensive line going against the offensive line that has caused problems within the game for a couple of years now, at least for this Madden and the previous Madden. If you guys take a look, we're going with a spread offense against a nickel defense, which is going to give 4 defensive linemen against 5 offensive linemen. What ends up happening a majority of the time is the defensive tackle going against the double team is going to be able to shed the double team. Now, you guys will see in this situation that he got his animation to get through the double team block here, but didn't actually break through, which is actually a little bit of an oddity. You guys will see right here, gets that block shed animation, and what ends up happening a majority of times in Madden 22, and I believe in Madden 21 as well, is that player is going to shed that double team block and get to the quarterback. So what are the implications of this? Well, the first thing is obviously double team blocks are broken on the offensive line, so you can take advantage of that. You're not always going to necessarily know where that double team is going to be because depending on the strength of the offense, the 1 technique and the 3 technique are going to be switching left and right, so you can't always determine who is going to be in that 1 technique spot, which is the most likely player here to be double teamed. You're not always going to be able to line somebody up there. However, what you can do is take advantage of that. And I feel that one of the biggest issues that people face is that since this is one of the places that you will actually get the most consistent pressure, is people do not necessarily put the athletic players on the interior of their defensive line. So, if you ask me, it stands to reason that if the most consistent place you're going to be getting pressure in Madden 22 is against double teams, then you have to realize that double teams are going to be on the 1 technique player the majority of the time. You're not going to see double teams, generally speaking, outside of that unless a tight end is brought in to block. You're going to see double teams on the interior, and if the double team is the most consistently destroyed block, you would want an athletic player going against that double team. Well, what ends up happening, as you see on my defensive tackles depth chart, the majority of defensive tackles are going to be relatively unathletic. You're talking about players with speed in the 60s, acceleration in the 70s, and that just simply isn't going to get it done against the quarterbacks of today's game. There's so many athletic quarterbacks, there's so many quarterbacks that are going to find their receivers quickly. You're not going to get it done this way. Instead, you want to have your more athletic players on the inside, especially in pass rushing situations, in order to get to the quarterback quicker. So, for example, if I was trying to pick out my rushing defensive tackles, I would say the best two opportunities here to get to the quarterback would be Fletcher Cox and maybe Ndamukong Suh. Now, unfortunately, when you go to rushing defensive tackle, you can only put your defensive tackles and defensive ends here. You can't put any players outside of that in those positions, and you cannot put defensive tackles at your rushing defensive end positions. So if you have a player that you want on the field, like my rookie Jordan Davis, but I don't want to play him at that rushing defensive tackle spot because he's not athletic enough, I'm not going to be able to put him on the field anywhere else. So you're at a little bit of a disadvantage in that regard. You may want to consider moving that player to defensive end so they can then play both D-tackle and defensive end in those passing situations. However, you do want to consider the athleticism of these players because Fletcher Cox is more likely to get to the quarterback with 77 speed and 85 acceleration than a Jordan Davis with a 64 speed and a 77 acceleration. Then the next thing to consider with these players whenever they are rushing the quarterback is, in addition, some of their other agility stats and athletic stats, as well as their pursuit ability to the quarterback. So, for example, Fletcher Cox has 78 agility. He will be more readily able to change direction and get to the quarterback using minor adjustments that he needs to make in order to take the right line to the quarterback, whereas a guy like DJ Reader, who would be an 80 overall rushing defensive tackle, only has 68 agility. So when he gets back there, there's a very high likelihood that the quarterback's going to be able to evade him because he's not going to be able to make those minor change in direction in order to get to the quarterback. Likewise, we have to consider the pursuit of these players because defensive tackles like Fletcher Cox, for example, have very high pursuit, and that does allow them to better get after the quarterback. If you have a high pursuit number like that, then you're able to track down the quarterback better whenever you do get through your block and are trying to chase him down, run him down, and track him down. Whatever you're trying to do, those stats are very important for these players. So you do want to consider what you're putting out there. If you're, knowing that you're going to most consistently get pressure against double teams in this game, you're definitely going to want to consider the stats of who you're putting out there because you might be putting yourself at a disadvantage if you're putting traditional defensive tackles and nose tackles in those interior spots and expecting them to get some form of pass rush pressure. Likewise, if you run a 4-3 defense or a nickel defense, you're always going to have two defensive tackle positions out there, and one of those two is more than likely always going to be facing a double team, which means that what's going to happen is one of these two is more than likely going to be the one that's going to be getting that automatic pressure because double teams are broken in Madden 22. So if you have one suboptimal player there, you're hamstringing yourself. You're preventing yourself from getting the basic pressure that a lot of people probably are getting because they may be taking advantage of this. Now, the next thing to consider here is that quarterbacks are generally going to be slower to react to pressure against the left tackle. The reason being is that in recent years they programmed it into the game for the blind side blockers or the blind side to not really be picked up as well by the quarterback. It's a realistic change that they added to Madden. So generally, you're going to see the quarterback is facing, because he's a right-handed quarterback, more often than not, there are very few left-handed quarterbacks, the quarterback's going to be facing the right tackle. So you can see whenever we drop into this play, the quarterback is facing the right. He's facing to his right, so he's going to be better able to pick up any pressure coming from that side of the line. However, he's not going to be as easily able to pick up pressure from the left side of the line. So the point here is, what are we actually getting at? What does that actually affect in terms of how we utilize our defenders, how we utilize our defensive line and our pass rushers within the game? Well, there are a couple of different ways that we can utilize this. On a basic level, what we can do is we can flip, in passing situations, our best pass rusher to that right end spot, which is going to be going up against the left tackle. However, this is where I recommend bringing formation subs into play, because you don't want your same player always going up against the same exact matchup, and most of the time teams are passing nowadays. So if you go into your defensive subs and you just simply, for any of your nickel formations or your passing formations, basically with those rushing defensive end positions, if you just always automatically place your best defensive end at that rushing right end position, then they're going to be stuck in that matchup against that player all day. Instead, what I would recommend you do is, in obvious passing situations, which means obvious passing formations on the defensive side of the ball, when you know that the other team is going to be passing the ball, adjust in formation subs to put your pass rusher at that position, your best pass rusher at that position. So if I know, for example, that in my defense, whenever I'm going against passing situations, I like to call the dime formation a lot, then I'm absolutely going to go in here and I'm going to sub in my best pass rusher for Trey Hendrickson. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Von Miller off, and just for right this second, put Sam Hubbard there. I'm going to take Von Miller and put him at this defensive end position going against the weak side tackle, against the blind side, and I'm going to take my second best D end and put him against the right tackle. And there we go. Now in the formation that I call when I'm always going against obvious passing formations, my best pass rusher is going to be going up against the blind side tackle, and if he sheds that block, the quarterback will be less likely to respond to that pressure. And that is one of the most important things you can do, is adjust so that you make it so your players are quicker to get to the quarterback, and make it so that the quarterback can be slower to react to that pressure. Now, beyond that, you really have to get creative in order to get any type of additional pressure within Madden 22. What I like to do a lot of the times is I like to get edge rushers and play them as my interior pass rushers in those situations. So my rushing defensive tackles, outside of a guy like a Fletcher Cox, who I know is already athletic and is kind of a defensive end type of player, I like to get guys like a Sam Hubbard or a Trey Hendrickson or a Von Miller, and I like to have an extra one of those guys, and I like to play them on the inside because I want to have that speed and athleticism to go after the quarterback whenever those passing situations arise. I think people underestimate how important athleticism is at your defensive line positions or at your pass rushing positions, because you want all four of these players to be quick enough to get to the quarterback. Otherwise, why are they out there on the field in those passing situations? If Jordan Davis sheds a block but is completely incapable of getting to the quarterback because of his 64 speed, what use does that serve? He'll never get a sack. He'll absolutely never get a sack because of the fact that he's just simply not athletic enough to get there. So you definitely want to consider some of the topics that I brought up today in terms of the way that you align your defensive line and your pass rushers in order to generate more pressure within Madden 22. Hopefully this video was helpful to you guys in some way. Like I said, this does apply to Madden 20 somewhat. It doesn't necessarily apply across all Maddens because things change year to year, but in the current state of the game, double teams are broken, the blind side block and the blind side of the quarterback is a real thing and can help get you better pressure if you're putting your better pass rusher on that side and things of that nature. So you definitely want to try to consider these things. Like I said, hopefully this information was helpful to you in some way. If it was, please leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and comment down below. I'll see you guys in the next one, and I hope you have a good one.